Wren Okafor had her arm shoulder deep in the coolant housing when the light above her head flickered for the third time that shift, and nobody else in the bay even looked up. That was the thing about Kirewell Crossing. Nothing here was supposed to flicker. The station ran on Ithran systems that repaired themselves before a fault ever reached a human eye. They were self-diagnosing. Self-healing. Quietly perfect, the way a species with 300 years of uninterrupted infrastructure tended to build things. Wren's job, technically, was to supervise that perfection. Mostly her job was to fix the small, boring failures the perfect systems were too proud to admit they still had. She pulled her arm free, wiped a smear of blue coolant on her coveralls, and reseated the housing with a fitting that didn't quite match the part number stamped into the wall behind it. "That connector is rated for a different pressure class," said the Ithran technician standing at a respectful distance, arms folded, watching her the way people watched a stranger doing something faintly embarrassing in public. "It's rated close enough," Wren said. "It'll hold until the real part comes in on the next supply run. Podren will want it logged as temporary. Podren can want whatever he likes. Log it." The technician logged it, then left without another word, the particular silence of someone who had decided the conversation wasn't worth continuing. Wren had gotten used to that silence over 4 years on contract here. The Ithran called it efficiency. She called it what it was. Davasare dropped into the seat across the workbench, already peeling the wrapper off a ration bar with the single-minded focus he gave anything involving food. "Podren's doing his rounds," he said. "Full inspection posture. Hands behind his back and everything. Wonderful. He's going to ask why we're still patching housing seals by hand when the station's supposed to grow new ones. Then I'll tell him the station's growing them slower than it used to." Dav paused with the ration bar halfway to his mouth. "Is it?" Wren hadn't meant to say it out loud, not really, not as anything more than a tired complaint at the end of a long shift. But now that it was sitting between them, she turned it over properly for the first time. 3 housing failures this week. 2 backup relays that should have regrown their burned couplings overnight, and hadn't. A ventilation loop on the lower ring that kept losing pressure by amounts too small to trigger an alert but too consistent to be nothing. "Probably nothing," she said. "Old systems get tired even when they're not supposed to." Kirewell Crossing had been built on a simple theory. A station this far out, on a corridor this contested, needed to run itself. The people who could afford to staff it properly would never agree to live this far from anywhere that mattered. So it ran itself, beautifully, and the handful of human contractors who'd signed on generations back to cover the gaps nobody expected to matter had slowly become something closer to tradition than necessity. Wren had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about the early years of the contract, when a human hand on a wrench had meant something out here. She'd taken the job anyway, because the pay was honest and the work, whatever anyone thought of it, was real. Podren found them 20 minutes later, exactly as Dav had promised, hands clasped behind his back, his soft gray-green skin catching the bay's overhead light in a way that always made him look faintly luminous. He was not unkind. That was the frustrating part. He was careful, precise, and entirely convinced that the human maintenance contract was a courtesy Kirewell Crossing's board kept renewing out of habit rather than need. "The coolant housing," he said, studying Wren's handiwork with the particular attention of someone checking a child's homework. "Mismatched fitting. Held pressure fine on the test cycle. It will hold until it doesn't. I would rather we wait for the correct part. The correct part is 4 days out on the supply ship. This housing wasn't going to make it 4 hours." Podren considered that, the way he considered most things Wren said, politely, thoroughly, and without ever quite believing it mattered. "I've asked engineering to prioritize a root cause diagnostic on the recent housing failures," he said. "Once we understand the underlying degradation pattern, I expect the self-repair systems will correct it without further manual intervention." "That's a good plan," Wren said, and meant it, mostly. "In the meantime, this one's not going to leak." "No," Podren agreed. "I don't doubt your hands are capable, Wren. I only doubt they should still be necessary. He said it without malice. He said it the way you note the weather. Wren had heard some version of that sentence at least once a month since she'd signed the contract, and she still hadn't found a way to make it land any softer. She was midway through explaining, again, why hand-fitted seals sometimes outlasted grown ones, something about thermal cycling, something Padron nodded along to without really absorbing, when he asked, almost as an afterthought, why humans still bothered learning trades like this at all, back on Earth, when so much of what she described sounded like problems a properly designed system should never have in the first place. Wren thought about that longer than the question probably deserved. Because for most of our history, nothing was properly designed, she said. You fixed what you had with what you had. You didn't wait for the right part, because the right part usually wasn't coming. That doesn't go away just because the ships got better. It sounds exhausting, Padron said, not unkindly. Some days, Wren said. Mostly it's just what my hands know how to do when nobody's told them to stop. She was still turning the thought over when the lights across the entire bay dimmed at once, held for 2 full seconds, and came back up slightly wrong. Not flickering. Dimmer. As if the whole system had briefly forgotten how bright it was supposed to be. Padron's easy patience disappeared in an instant. He turned toward the nearest console, already keying through diagnostics, his fingers moving with the fast, practiced confidence of someone who had never in his life had to fix something the console couldn't explain to him. Power distribution fault, he said. Automated correction already initiating. Already? Wren asked. Half a second, maybe less. It won't even register as a formal incident. The light steadied. The console cleared its warning. Padron exhaled, satisfied, already halfway back to his rounds. Wren didn't move. She was watching the readout over his shoulder, the one he'd already dismissed, the one that showed the automated correction hadn't actually fixed anything. It had rerouted around the fault instead. Quietly. Efficiently. In a way that would leave no trace unless someone was still looking 2 seconds after everyone else had stopped. She was still looking. Later that night, lying in the narrow crew berth she'd occupied for 4 years without ever quite calling it home, she found herself thinking about the question Padron had asked her, the one about why humans still bothered learning trades that shouldn't be necessary. She didn't have a better answer than the one she'd given him. But she kept coming back to the readout, to the 2 seconds the automation had taken to hide something instead of the half second it usually took to fix it, and the thoughts sat with her, quiet and unwelcome, until she finally slept. By the end of the week, Wren had a list. She kept it the old way, on a physical slate, because the station's own logging system was exactly the thing she'd stopped trusting to notice a pattern in itself. 7 faults now. Housing seals, redundancy relays, 1 section of ventilation baffling that had rerouted itself twice in 3 days without ever throwing a real alarm. Every single one had been quietly absorbed by the automation before it became a formal incident. That was the part that bothered her. Kirewell Crossing systems were built to heal, not to hide. You're doing the thing, Dove said, watching her stare at the slate over dinner in the crew mess, a narrow room tucked between 2 cargo lifts that the 3 of them had claimed as unofficially theirs. What thing? The thing where you go quiet and I know we're about to have extra work. Priya Lindqvist slid into the seat beside him, her tablet already open to the ventilation schematics Wren had asked her to pull that afternoon. Priya was newer than Wren and Dov, only 18 months into her contract, but she had the kind of patient, unhurried attention that made her better than either of them at noticing when a number was 1 decimal off from where it should be. I cross-reference your list against the maintenance archive, Priya said. Every fault you flagged hit a redundancy system. Not a primary system, not once. Backup relays, secondary seals, the auxiliary vent loop instead of the main one. Could be coincidence, Dov said, without much conviction. 7 for 7 isn't coincidence, Priya said. It's a pattern. Somebody, or something, keeps testing exactly how much slack this station has before it would actually notice. She turned the tablet so they could both see it, a timeline she'd built out of nothing but timestamps and location tags. Look at the spacing. 2 days between the first and second fault. Then 1 day. Then 12 hours. Whatever's doing this isn't guessing anymore. It's learning how fast we notice, and it's getting faster than we are. That's not decay, Dov said quietly. That's reconnaissance. Wren didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the housing seal she'd patched by hand that first day, about how confidently she told Podren it would hold, and wondering, for the first time, whether the thing she'd been fighting all along wasn't old parts wearing out at all. Wren set the slate down carefully, the way you set down something you didn't quite want to be holding. On any properly maintained ship or station she'd worked, backups failed randomly, the way old parts always did, scattered across every system without any particular order. This wasn't scattered. This was methodical. Someone patient was mapping the exact edges of Kirewell Crossing's redundancy, one quiet failure at a time, and the station's own healing instincts were erasing the evidence almost as fast as it appeared. We should take this to Podren, Priya said. We should, Wren agreed. He won't believe it. She was right mostly. Podren listened to the full report the next morning with the same careful, unhurried attention he gave everything, nodding at the right places, asking 2 reasonable follow-up questions. He'd left an open monitoring flag on the system since the coolant housing, he admitted, and it hadn't independently confirmed a pattern. The automation kept smoothing over the very data it would have needed to analyze. That should have worried him more than it did. Instead, he explained, gently, that a full manual audit meant pulling 3 engineers off scheduled maintenance for a week, and the board wouldn't approve that kind of disruption on 7 minor incidents without a clearer case than a pattern he couldn't yet independently confirm. With respect, Wren said, your systems are healing these faults so fast that a full manual audit is the only way anyone would ever see them. With respect, Podren echoed, not unkindly. That's precisely the kind of thing the automation is designed to prevent us from needing. Wren didn't push it further. Some doors, she was learning, weren't worth arguing open. So what do we do? Dov said. If he won't authorize it? We do it anyway, Wren said. Quietly. On our own schedule. If it's nothing, it costs us some overtime nobody will ever thank us for. If it's something. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Priya was already pulling up a full map of every redundancy system on the station, the auxiliary loops and backup relays and secondary seals that had been so carefully, patiently mapped by whoever, or whatever, had been testing them, and the 3 of them spent the rest of that shift doing the one thing Kirewell Crossing's perfect systems had never been built to expect. They started checking, by hand, exactly how much slack was left. They found out how much slack was left 4 days later, at the worst possible moment, when the Culveth arrived. There was no warning volley, no opening barrage against the station's shielding, which Wren would later understand was the entire point. Kirewell Crossing's hull could take a real fight and win it. Every Culveth incursion on record had learned that the hard way. What the hull couldn't do was defend itself against something that never touched it at all. The first sign was the lights, again, dimming across the whole station at once, except this time they didn't come back steady. They came back flickering, and stayed that way, and the automated correction that had always handled it in half a second took 2, then 5, then simply stopped reporting a fix at all. Multiple redundancy failures, Podren's voice said over the comm, and for the first time since Wren had known him, it wasn't careful. It was fast, and underneath the fast there was something close to panic. Power routing, life support secondary loop, gravity plating on 3 decks. The automation isn't correcting. It's not even attempting correction. Because the automation is the thing that's compromised, Wren said, already moving, Dov and Priya falling in behind her without needing to be told. Somebody's been mapping every backup system on this station for a week. Now they're pulling all of them at once. That's not possible. Our systems don't fail together, they're isolated by design. They're isolated from each other. Priya cut in, breathless. checking a handheld readout as they ran. Not from whoever's inside the network telling them all, at the same time, that a repair already happened when it didn't. Kirewell Crossing's automation, Wren understood in the same instant Priya said it, hadn't been damaged. It had been lied to. Every fault the crew had logged over the past week had taught the Calvith exactly which false all-clear signal would make the station's own healing systems stand down without a fight. It was an elegant kind of attack, and a cruel one, because it turned 300 years of perfect self-repair into perfect, trusting blindness. They reached the primary junction on Deck 4 to find Padron already there, staring at a console full of systems that all insisted calmly that they were functioning normally while the deck around them went dark section by section. He looked, for the first time since Wren had met him, genuinely lost. "I don't know how to fix this by hand," he said. It cost him something to say it. "None of us do. We were never trained to. There was never a reason to be." "There is now," Wren said, and pulled the access panel off the junction with her bare hands instead of waiting for the tool that would have taken 10 seconds she didn't have. What followed was not clean, and it was not fast. Dov worked the structural bypasses on the far side of the junction. He spliced power routing through conduits that were never meant to carry it. The couplings were scavenged from 3 different equipment classes that had no business fitting together. He made them fit anyway. He burned his hand twice doing it, and didn't say a word about it until the fighting was over. Priya crouched over the life support relay with a terminal in one hand and a physical override switch in the other. System by system, she confirmed which readings were real and which were the Calvitha's false all clear, throwing out every lie one at a time while the deck plates hummed unsteady beneath her knees. More than once the terminal told her a loop was healthy right up until the moment her own hand on the relay told her otherwise. Each time, she trusted the relay, not the screen. Wren worked the gravity plating, her hands full of mismatched parts. She'd worked 100 smaller failures over 4 years. Now there were 6 of them at once, and every second mattered. Somewhere below them, distant enough to feel unreal, she could hear the dull percussion of a boarding force cutting through an outer hatch that should have sealed itself and hadn't. "If this doesn't hold," Dove said, not looking up from the conduit in his hands, "how long before real defenses come back online?" "I don't know," Wren said. "So we make sure it holds." Padron, after a long, frozen moment, knelt down beside her and asked what she needed him to hold. It should have felt like a small thing. It didn't. This was an engineer who had never in his life needed hands like hers, kneeling anyway, learning in real time how to jury-rig a coupling that wasn't rated for the pressure it was about to carry. The lights held. Not because the automation came back, it wouldn't, not for hours yet, but because 3 humans and 1 very frightened Ithran engineer kept every critical system alive by hand, one deliberate, ugly, mismatched fix at a time, buying the station's real defense grid the minutes it needed to come back online the honest way. Priya finally noticed Dov's hand somewhere in the quiet after, the raw skin across his palm where the conduit had gotten away from him twice, and wrapped it in gauze from the emergency kit without asking permission. He let her, which told her more about how much it hurt than anything he actually said. Somewhere above them, the Calvith boarding force that had expected to walk into a station already strangled by its own trusting systems met, instead, gravity that hadn't failed, life support that hadn't failed, and a defense grid stuttering back to life exactly when they'd been told it never would. They broke off within the hour. Wren didn't see it happen. She was still on her knees on Deck 4, hands raw, watching a readout climb back toward numbers that made sense, when the comm crackled with word that the boarding party had pulled back from a hatch they'd expected to walk through unopposed, and a real defense grid, honest and unhurried, had finally caught up to the fight it had been lied out of joining. Padron, beside her, didn't celebrate. He looked, instead, at the coupling still in her hands, the ugly, mismatched, working thing that had bought them the hour they needed, and quietly asked her to show him how it worked, so that next time, he said, he wouldn't need to ask what to hold. The board convened a formal review 3 days later, the kind of meeting Wren had never once been invited to in 4 years on contract. She was invited to this one. Sanaya, The station's overseer sat at the head of a long table with the particular stillness of someone who had spent the last 3 days reading incident reports she clearly wished had turned out differently. Podren sat beside her, and beside him, without needing to be asked twice, sat Wren, Dav, and Priya, still faintly smelling of coolant and scorched conduit no shower had fully removed. The independent audit confirms your crew's account, Sanea said. The Kalvath infiltrated our automated diagnostic network approximately 11 days before the attack. They tested the same redundancy points your crew happened to be logging, not because your logs helped them find those points, but because those points were always the weakest ones on the station. Had your team not been keeping records by hand, we would have had no evidence any of it happened. Our own systems would have erased the intrusion completely. They very nearly did, Podren said quietly. Sanea was quiet for a moment, studying the 3 humans across the table the way Wren had once watched Sanea's own technicians study a fitting they didn't recognize, carefully, and without the easy dismissal Wren had gotten used to. Your contract comes up for renewal in 6 months, she said finally. I intend to expand it. Considerably. That's a start, Wren said. You could also stop treating every mismatched fitting like a problem. It wasn't quite a joke. Sanea didn't quite laugh. Her tone stayed brisk, the tone of someone already 3 items further down an agenda in her head, but something in her posture eased, the particular ease of a debt being settled plainly instead of gracefully. 2 of my engineers requested reassignment to your crew this morning, she said. Not to supervise. To learn. I approved it before they'd finished asking. They'll hate it for the first week, Wren said. Everyone does. Nothing fits the way it's supposed to. Good, Sanea said. That's usually when people start paying attention. The formal part of the meeting ended not long after, the way formal meetings always did, with commitments to review contract terms and update training protocols that would take months to actually happen. Wren didn't mind. She hadn't expected the fixing itself to end. Not everyone on the station came around as quickly as Sanea had. In the days that followed, Wren still caught the occasional sideways glance in a corridor from technicians who'd rather not dwell on how close their own systems had come to failing them completely. Trust built over 3 days in a boardroom didn't erase 4 years of being politely tolerated, and she didn't expect it to. It was a start. Starts were usually the hardest part. 3 weeks later, she was back in the maintenance bay, shoulder deep in a housing that had nothing to do with sabotage or Kalvath or anything except an old part finally giving out the ordinary way, when Podren knelt down across from her, uninvited, and held the housing steady without being asked. Wrong pressure class again, he said, nodding at the fitting in her hand. It'll hold. I know, he said. I've started keeping a set like it. In case the correct part is 4 days out again. Wren looked at him for a moment, at the small, deliberate set of mismatched tools now sitting in his own kit, tools he'd never have carried 3 weeks ago, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. Across the bay, Priya was walking one of Sanea's newly reassigned engineers through the ventilation baffling, patiently explaining why a part that didn't match the schematic could still be the right part, and the engineer was listening the way Podren had learned to listen, slowly, and without the old certainty that the schematic was always the last word. Dove had already claimed a corner of the bay for what he was calling, only half joking, a proper scrap collection, on the theory that Kirewell Crossing was about to discover it needed a great many things that didn't officially exist in its inventory yet. Somewhere above them, the station hummed on, healed and healing, trusting its own systems again in the careful, verified way it hadn't before. And on Deck 4, in a maintenance bay nobody outside it would ever think to call important, a human contractor and an Ithran engineer finished a small, unglamorous repair together, the same way they always had, except now one of them was watching not to judge the work, but to learn it.